Thank you so much. My name is Johannes Schumann. As mentioned, I'm the Director of Community Planning, formerly Director of Development and Urban Design with the City of Burnaby. I have a 22-year history working for the city and have worked on a lot of the major developments throughout the city and trying to find good ways of bringing the vision of citizens and community members into these developments. And I can say that my sort of presentation today is not as inspirational as Elder Jackie and maybe not as informative as our planners, Vivian and Danae. Hopefully I have a little bit of fun, go through the process quite quickly, and I want to hear your thoughts and I want to have a dialogue with you guys and help to sort of inform how development can bring forward the goals and amenities we want to see in our community. So just a brief overview of what we're going to talk about today is an introduction and then sort of a development financing overview. To your point, how does the cost of housing result in the buildings that we see? What goes into those costs? I'll give you a master plan example. We work on two major development types, master plans, which are multi-phase developments or multi-building developments, and then a site-specific example, a single development, and how we sort of go through the development process and what those costs are. As well as discussing some opportunities and challenges we've been thrust upon us, some new provincial legislation we have to integrate, and how does that affect how we can actually procure amenities and services for the city. And then last, I really want to open up to questions and answers and have a discussion with you guys. So we'll start with a bit of a silly question. When you look at development and the average developer, what do you see? Do you see the altruistic investor that wants to make their community better? Or do we see somebody who wants to grab as much money as they can, profit, and leave a community? Well, interestingly enough, it's a little bit of both. So that's where the city comes into that conversation. Development needs to be economically viable, but we require those services, amenities, and investment in our community based on the needs of our citizens. So that's really where the city's role is to sort of temper the expectation of how much money you can make and what you have to provide in terms of services. So how do we go about actually determining what can be built? And how can a developer sort of come to a municipality and say, I want to build a building. How can I do that? Well, it starts with the plan. We ultimately say, just follow the plan. And so there's 3 or 4 levels of plans that we have within the city. We have a regional plan, which is the Metro Vancouver Regional Growth Strategy that determines land uses more broadly amongst the 27 member municipalities, identifying where residential growth can be, commercial growth, industrial, agricultural. We have to follow that when creating our official community plan. So the official community plan provides land use designations and policies for the city more broadly, and that's quite high level. And then it sort of dials down into the specific neighborhood plans, and what I have here, pretty low resolution, but is the Metrotown Downtown Plan. And what that shows is a number of land uses that are spread throughout the area where a developer can come forward and say, well, I want to build a high-rise development, I want to build a townhouse development, where can I do that? The actual neighborhood plan would demonstrate what that is, how much floor area they can build, and what's required on behalf of the city. In doing so, we have to sort of follow through with our zoning bylaw and other land use policies. As mentioned, the rental use zoning policy or tenant assistance policy have to be followed in order to actually advance that development. So there's not as much flexibility and freedom as you might think. When they come in and say, I want to build this, first thing we say is follow the plan. That's where you have to start. When they come in to see the city and they want to have a meeting and they want to talk about what they can and can't do, really it's what we consider due diligence. They want to understand all the steps of that development before they start. And that really starts with confirming what can be built. I want to build a residential development. No, this is an industrial area. This is the residential areas that's designated in the plan. Okay, well, I want to look at something that can be 30 stories in height. I want something that can be residential mixed use. We then sort of work with them in the plans to determine what can be done on that site, and then they can go and look at sites where they might be able to achieve those goals. The next big thing is really understanding what the city is going to require in terms of that development. It's not a free-for-all. They don't come in and say, I want to do this. If I don't get this, I'm going to walk. We'll say, there's the door. You essentially want to ensure that they know all the requirements of development, and we call them prerequisite conditions to development, where they have to meet all these conditions, policies of council, and other sort of guidelines before they can actually advance, and that includes fees and amenities and such. They want to know how long it's going to take. So how long is the typical development process? We'd love to get that time frame to be shorter, to be able to get more housing to market faster, both non-market and market. But right now, our development process takes an average of 3 years. And that's a rezoning application, subdivision and creating the lots, development permitting, and building permitting. A 3-year process from beginning to end in order to get those approved. And you say, well, why does it take 3 years? How could it possibly take 3 years? Because we want to make sure we go through all of those policies and steps to make sure they meet all of them. We circulate out to all our departments. We circulate out to outside agencies like RCMP, Ministry of Transportation, Ministry of Housing, to make sure that we meet those guidelines before we approve the application, so we don't rush through it. The problem is we're being a little bit too diligent in going through all those things, and maybe we think maybe we can deregulate a little bit, understand exactly what we need to do, and not everything, and we can capture those as different parts of the process. Big thing for them is how much is it going to cost. So what are the costs associated with developing, both in terms of construction costs. We're going to go through a sort of a very simplified pro forma or overall budget for a development. How much is it going to cost to go through this development, and how much money am I going to make at the end? The how much money you make in the end is an interesting conundrum, because developers don't come to a development with money in pocket. You think that they do, but essentially they'll have enough money to maybe put a down payment or an option on a property. The rest of it is financed through banks, and the banks want to know that you're going to make between 10 and 15% profit, or they don't give you any money. And so knowing how much money they're going to take in is actually what gives them the ability to borrow the money to do the development. And the last thing, after all that's done, is they make an application with the city. So this is basically a really simplified breakdown of what those costs are associated with a development. I'm going to walk around this side here. So I took an example of what would make up the cost of $1 million unit. And so this basically demonstrates that a significant amount of the costs come in terms of land and construction. Of a development, roughly 25% of the total development cost is land cost, and then 30% of the overall construction is, project budget is construction cost. Those are somewhat fixed costs. So the land cost, yes, is a function of how much you can develop on the site, but the proportions of how much that land cost is don't change. 10% of the overall cost is municipal fees. Our next slide will get into what those municipal fees are and what we require from development. Part of the municipal fees as well are site servicing. So when they come to develop in the city, they need to build new roads, sidewalks, cycle tracks, new sanitary sewers, water lines, storm sewer lines, street lights, as well as provide for other services, including on-site open spaces and such. And that equates to about 5% of the cost. Now, as I mentioned before, the overall costs are borrowed, so they have to then take into account financing. So when they borrow those costs, right now it's slightly higher than 5%. You're probably at about 6.5% of what a construction loan would be. But that's where a healthy sort of economy is around 5% financing costs. Consulting fees are hiring their architects, their engineers, their landscape architects, marketing consultants to sort of advance the development. And then once all of those other fees are taken into account, they can determine what their profit margin is. And as I mentioned before, a bank wants to see a healthy profit of between 10 and 15%, and that's over a 3 to 5 year time horizon. So while they have multiple projects on the go, their revenues would be 10 to 15% multiplied by how many projects they have. But if you took an investment and you put it into stock market, you'd do better than 10% profit over 3 years. So the difficulty is it's an order of magnitude. So there's not as much revenue that comes from development as you might think. If they do their job properly, they can then take that contingency and roll that back into profit, but really 10 to 15% is sort of the maximum you get. And we look at what's called a pro forma analysis to say, okay, of all these project costs, are you making your sufficient profit, and do we have an appropriate amount of fees and charges that we're not breaking the back of development? And what I'll get into a little bit is that municipal fees. What does that mean? What equates to 10% of municipal fees? So what's in it for the city for development? So some of the things we get out of those municipal fees, development fees, as I mentioned, sort of rezoning fees, building permit, development permit, subdivision fees, those go towards offsetting the cost of taxation and other means of the city to obtain revenue. So we take suitable amounts of fees to ensure that we can then provide the services and works to the city on a sustainable basis, and that helps to fund operating costs. So the day-to-day operation of the city, we can't take necessarily from other revenue sources. We can obtain some of that through development fees. Otherwise, it would have to come via taxes. City services are a big one. And so again, as I mentioned, what does the developer have to pay when they develop? Well, we say your site is unserviced or underserviced. You need to provide a bike lane. You need to provide new curbs, new street lights, new street trees, boulevard grass, sidewalks, sanitary sewers, and such. Those services then come to the city as our assets, and they serve not just that development, but a neighborhood as a whole. A key one that was mentioned is sort of our rental use zoning program. So since 2019, we have an affordable rental use zoning program, essentially that requires 20% of the market development of a residential development to be provided as non-market housing. That non-market housing has to be operated by a nonprofit housing provider, and it goes through a housing agreement to ensure that in the perpetuity, the length of that building, it stays as non-market housing, that 20% is secured. Other things that we look at are social and recreational amenities. So as you look around Metrotown, you're like, wow, these buildings are huge. How did they get so big? Well, we provide an opportunity for a density bonus or additional height and density where amenities are provided. And so that goes towards paying for nonprofit office spaces like the Metrotown Resource Center on Beresford. Or it goes towards a collection where we take cash in lieu. We can put that towards facility replacement, like replacing Bonzer. We collect money, get to a certain amount of money where then we can actually build new facilities without taking that out of tax base. And so social and recreational amenities come out of development. Parks and open spaces, so interestingly enough, the provincial legislation enables us to take 5% of a site's area for open space. And so where we have large sites, say for example, the redevelopment of Metropolis, which is on the books now, we'd be taking a 3 to 4 acre new park as a requirement of development, plus taking funds for parkland acquisition elsewhere in the city as a requirement of development. Public art is a key component. We want to ensure that the development provides benefit to those that don't just live on the site, but more broadly in a neighborhood. So we require public art from every development, and that's 1% of the overall project costs. And then sort of the other things that we see we take from development is new taxation, both commercial taxes and residential taxes for new residents, as well as the jobs that may be created on the site through new commercial opportunities, as well as the high-paying construction jobs that go into sort of developing these spaces. So I'm going to provide you 2 examples of how we go through a negotiated process. So development in Burnaby usually starts with a rezoning application. That's change the zone from existing use, like single family, to a new use, which is multifamily, high density, or commercial. And so I'm going to provide 2 examples. One is the master plan. This one is called the Brentwood block. It's done by a company called Grosvenor. It's in the Brentwood town center across from the Brentwood Mall. It comes as a block of Alpha, Beta, Lougheed, and Dawson. Unfortunately, the image is not particularly clear, but I'll describe it to you a bit. So in this master plan, the density in the Brentwood Town Center plan allows for roughly about 6 residential towers, plus commercial. But when we entered that site, we recognized right away that this was an opportunity to take a whole block. How can we approach this differently? So there's this negotiated quid pro quo in the development process where we try to continue to push even beyond what our plans allow for to get the best possible outcome for the residents. And so in the 6 residential towers, we're like, well, would you be open to looking at market rental as some opportunities? And they said, yeah, you know, I think market rental would work for us as a company. We could propose 2 of the 6 buildings as market rental. Well, those market rental buildings and the 4 remaining strata buildings both require non-market housing to be built. So of the total 6 buildings, the 2 rental, the 4 strata, they're required to provide 20% non-market housing, which results in 452 non-market rental units. The 517 market rental units, the ones that we negotiated through them just to provide that other sort of component of the housing spectrum. On the site as well, because there's sort of like a great opportunity to take a whole block, we recognize that Willingdon Heights Community Center being quite small and quite old, we need a new community facility to serve the residents of Brentwood. So we proposed, hey, you are looking to have a density bonus on the site, increase your density. That would roughly yield about $100 million in density bonus fees. What would you think about building a community center for the city that the city owns on the site? And they thought about it and said, okay, no, we could consider that. And in so doing, we lock them into providing that community center. We go through construction agreements, we go through contractual agreements, and now we have the proposal to build a new community center on the site, which is a 100,000 square foot community center facing Dawson Street. Other items that we came in, well, you know, this is a really good opportunity. It's so close to the Brentwood SkyTrain station. We have a high number of seniors and a high number of families with young kids. Why don't we really look at a fully accessible site? So in the planning of the site, we proposed, well, why don't you put all of the parking, all of the loading, all of the access underground and make the entire surface accessible with no vehicles? Exactly to the point that was raised previously, let's look at an option. We can go for car-free for this block. And so in this proposal here, essentially there's no streets on the surface. There's only access points on the 3 frontages at Beta, Dawson, and Alpha. And then in order to try to make sure that we have 100% accessibility, you can roll, if you have mobility challenges, right from the SkyTrain station to the community center. And we then required a handy dart stop to be under the community center to ensure that we get that full accessibility. The last thing is that all frontages, as with all developments we have now, would have cycle paths, and there's separated cycle facilities that then separates pedestrians and cyclists and takes cyclists off the road to ensure that we can walk and roll to a new community center. So those are, we are running out of time a bit, sorry. And that essentially that gives the opportunity for us to sort of get what most we can get out of development. We just started with 6 residential towers. These are some of the other things that we negotiate through that process. The site-specific example is in Metrotown. It's called Telford on the Walk. It's between Maywood and Beresford on Telford. It had 1 residential tower and 1 low-rise. I just want to sort of bring to your attention, when you see a separated low-rise building beside a tower, 99% of the time, that's non-market housing, and you wouldn't be able to tell. It doesn't look any different from the residential tower below. We want to ensure there's not a pour door concept. It doesn't look like you're living in separate units. You're actually integrated into the development. So this proposal had 332 market strata units, but interestingly enough, it had an existing 54-unit replacement, or 54-unit rental building on the site. We required the developer to place those units at the same rental cost that the rent was before development. And so we worked with them and their non-market consultant, Catalyst, to go through the replacement process. They saw an opportunity to add an additional 12 market median rental units, which are still below market, but a little higher than the non-market replacement. We had to look at other sort of public benefits, including public walkways to connect the neighborhood through the site, public art. And one of the key components to note is that in the tenant assistance process, where we require them to replace the units, they get offset density or additional density to pay for those non-market units, but what we don't compensate for is the tenant assistance. And so where tenants are required to move out of a unit temporarily for up to 3 to 4 years, that the developer pays for the rent top-ups, the difference between their current rent and the other rents for that period of time, pays for moving expenses to move them back into the replacement unit at the same rent they paid before. That's not compensated, that's just a cost of doing business. So in the discussion, if you're gonna develop in Maywood, you're gonna develop in Metrotown, and you're gonna replace housing, you have to pay to take care of those tenants. So I won't go through this very quickly, but then all that planning process that we undertake is informed a lot by provincial legislation, and we've been thrust upon us a number of new pieces of provincial legislation that change how we negotiate tenant assistance, how we negotiate amenities, how we negotiate services, and we have to bring that into the hopper to think how we can actually do that now in a bit of a different way, but again, always working for the citizens of Burnaby. So that's basically my overview of Development 101. I'm happy to answer any questions about any sort of development, how we go about it.
Thank you so much, Johannes. And we don't have a ton of time, but we can do a couple of questions. So please. Okay, I'm just going to check if anybody who hasn't spoken yet today wants to speak before we go back to folks who have had a say already.
Well, I didn't actually finish my...
Oh, right, your questions from last time. I'm sorry, Charlie. You're right.
No worries. Thanks. Really appreciate you coming here and giving this breakdown. It's actually very, very informative. I have a ton of questions. One, I want to make a quick comment that I think saying 10% for the fees and 5% for site servicing, I think also misses that there's a bunch of like indirect taxation effectively going on with all the other things that we're requiring with like the non-market housing, public art, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not saying I necessarily disagree, but I think a holistic thing of comparing if it was like none of these additional things, amenities that we wanted, what would that look like? Because we're also adding additional constraints in terms of, hey, this is our development plan, this is the maximum density. We're trading off density. If we can trade off means we could have given it in the first place, but what would that actually do for like affordability? My main question though, is that when it comes down to say like the fees and whatever, you mentioned that some of that goes into like the operating budget for the city or whatnot. I want you to justify to me, because you mentioned that that's also supposed to be sustainable. If development is paying for operation, I don't understand how that can be sustainable because that we require continuous development.
Well, there's a very good point. So it offsets the taxation increases. So I don't want to be lambasted in this room or if council comes by. Our actual increase in taxation rate is about 10% per year. We keep it at 5% due to offsetted costs and things like that. So the development fees that we get and other sort of financial returns we might get on investment offset what we'd otherwise require in increased taxation.
So to follow up on that then, are we not just doing like a wealth transfer from people who are, you know, landowners right now to people who are potential landowners in the future, which basically enriches the incumbents while taking money from people who are, you know, basically younger, people who don't own property or whatnot?
So that's a great point. So this is something we grapple with a lot. So when we look at the $1 million unit example, if we said, okay, let's reduce that cost, those city fees, would they sell a unit for less than $1,200 per square foot? And the answer is no. So therefore, the profit margin goes up, or the land cost that you pay to the vendor goes up. So this is the catch-22. In doing the economic analysis, we're trying to dial that appropriately to knowing what the market can bear in terms of the cost, we'd love to be able to drive down that cost. And so we've been thinking about what other ways do we put covenants and restrictions on how much they can market a unit for. Well, that's not going to work. We're going to artificially change the cost. What we're attempting to do in our new zoning bylaw is look at the economic analysis and maybe determine what the vendor return is on the land sale. So that 30% cost, 25% cost for land, maybe that should be more like 15. And therefore we can bring the cost of the units down by reducing the overall acquisition cost of land to begin with. So we're looking at those things right now, but manipulating market position is very difficult, right? and probably not the best thing to do.
Thanks, Charlie. All right, I think, had a question? All right, thanks, Joseph.
I'm Joseph. This is with regard to land use. How does the cities differentiate between parks, open space, and green space?
That's an excellent question. We've been grappling with that with our land use framework in the OCP right now. What's a park in terms of its active use? Is it a field? Is it a baseball diamond? Is it a plaza space? Versus open space, which may be more naturalized. Is it a creek ravine? Is it an environmentally sensitive area that's forested? So we're then classifying where are active recreational spaces, where are passive, more intrinsic environmental spaces, and what are sort of more hardscape plaza areas in that OCP process.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Yeah.
So on the breakdown of the financing that you provided, I'm just wondering, is that more of a guideline that you guys provided, or is that how accurate is that?
This is simplified quite a bit. In a typical pro forma or project budget, there's many more line items, but this represents the broader percentages of what you'd pay for those various items, and that's what they'd have to analyze first before they acquire a parcel of land. Not to get too nerdy on it, but essentially land costs are determined by what's called a residual land. So once you take into account all those costs, that's how much you can pay for the land at the end of the process. So those represent sort of within 2 or 3% what a typical project would have to be in order to get that 10 to 15% profit to make a project pan out.
Thanks, Siobhan. Sorry, Michelle?
Yeah, sorry. Putting a participant hat on. I'm just curious, actually, can you speak a little bit more about the land costs? Because my understanding is that that is something that the city can sometimes offer. So when you were saying that that is, I forgot if it was 20 or 30% or 25%?
Yeah.
Yeah, 25%. If the city owns that land, is that money also then able to come into the city? And then the city can also offer that land, which would then reduce the price by 25%.
That's an excellent point. So yes, we've taken a position now that we're really not disposing of city land by sale anymore, but we had in the past. So Burn Park Drive and Southridge was a property that we sold to a developer. In so doing, we charge what the land cost is. It goes back into the city in terms of increased revenue, and then we were able to buy other sites for, say, non-market housing. But exactly to your point, if we say lease a site at a nominal cost, taking away the land value, then we can require non-market housing. So land being free is actually one of the main mechanisms to achieve non-market housing, and that's what we're attempting to do through the new Burnaby Housing Authority.
Okay, I think we're going to leave it there. I want to really thank you, Johannes. That was a lot of information for the Assembly to consider. All right, between